You probably have a question that you have in the back of your mind whenever you hear Bible readings or sermons. I do. An important question for me in relation to the church and theology has always been, well, what difference will it make? It's still a guiding question for me when I'm thinking about theology and the role of the church today. What difference will it make? So when I came to consider the reading set for today, I asked myself the same question: what difference will it make to hear this familiar parable again? I started my pondering by recalling the context for Matthew's Gospel and wondering what was going on at the time and what difference the writer we call Matthew might have hoped his writings would have made for his audience in those last decades of the first century. This Gospel, written perhaps around 90 CE, addresses Matthew's Jewish Christian community. Those last decades of the first century, as we've heard many times, was a period of heightened hostility between the growing Jewish Christian community and the non-Christian Jewish community. This tension was likely exacerbated by the destruction of the Temple and Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 CE. Following the destruction, there was a turbulent time in which there was a reassertion of power and control in the cities by the Roman colonial powers and a decrease in the Jewish population as many were pushed out of the cities and relocated in the countryside. Within the cultural confusion, it was likely there was a renewed emphasis on Jewish identity, with the Pharisees rising to power and reasserting Jewish protocol and religious practices as they coped with Roman rule and cross-cultural confusion. There was, concurrently, an increase in the Gentile population, with Romans and Greeks, including Gentile Christians, entering the cities. The situation is volatile. Matthew is caught in a conundrum. He is Jewish, and he sees the Jesus story as deeply rooted in Judaism. And he is a member of the emerging Christian community. And he sees the proclamation of Jesus' teaching with its affirmations about God's relationship with humanity, its ethical imperatives and instructions, and its promises as the salvation story for all humanity, Jews and Gentiles. It was into this hostile and volatile context that Matthew's Jesus is speaking. Historians suggest Matthew's audience was largely comprised of Jewish peasants, many of whom may have been resettled outside the new and refurbished cities. And we know some were given land grants in Upper Galilee, and others not so lucky had to find livelihoods as best they could. The area in Upper Galilee was much drier and a more difficult climate than southern Galilee, so making a living from the land was hard work. And Matthew uses lots of food and food-growing references in the parables his Jesus tells, like the one we've had this morning. So you can imagine, with that as a background, given those conditions, how shocking it would have been to the ears of the struggling peasants to hear of a wasteful farmer throwing expensive seed everywhere, indiscriminately. In the best of conditions at the time, not all seed grew. Perhaps 1 in 6 or 1 in 4 if you were lucky. So to cast it among the weeds on the stony paths where they had no chance was just downright wasteful. What was Matthew hoping for? What difference did he hope this parable would make to his hearers in the midst of their daily life and struggle? We surmise from the Gospels in general that Jesus seldom explained the parables that he used. But Matthew, perhaps not sure of his diverse audience and not sure that it would get the message, or perhaps by interpolation of a later redactor, he does explain, as we heard. He challenges his audience to think about what sort of ground they are as the seed comes to them. Jesus and his vision, his generous love and compassion being the seed, and God the sower, as referenced in the Isaiah reading. When the people heard the messages embedded in the stories of Jesus that were accumulating and circulating, what difference would they make? How would they understand these coded messages? And that same question applies to us. What difference will those same stories make to our lives? What impact on us will the vision of a renewed and restored human community, living peaceably at one with the earth that sustains us and all living things, make to our choices about our lives and relationships with others, with other sentient beings, and with the earth herself? What difference will they make? It seems to me, unless the stories we hear week by week make a difference somehow, big or little, we are stony ground. And the potential of the seed available to us is wasted. As individuals and as church, it is good to reflect on the difference we would like to make in our time, in this time of climate crisis, of disgruntlement, of despair and fear that is circulating in our community. And unless we can imagine how the world could be, we have no alternative vision to strive for. So, as we face the intensification of the fossil fuel-fed climate crisis, with its flow-on impact on food production, homelessness, identity and livelihoods, it behoves us to ask, what difference will our stories make? Matthew was challenging his hearers to accept that God was with them, urging them not to forget the covenant between God and humanity, that covenant that can be relied on. So make your choice, he seems to be saying. You can be passive, you can fall into despair, or you can choose to make a difference and be hopeful. You can grow a hopeful, sustainable future if you choose to. And now I'm asking, are you offering hopeful ways ahead? Or are you exacerbating fear? Are you being life-affirming? Or are you passive commentators and critics, making self-protective responses and not wanting to move from the places that you know how to manage? What difference do you want our proclamations, our words and our actions to make? In the main, people today are urban dwellers. In Aotearoa, in 2021, Statistics New Zealand reported more than 87% of us lived in urban situations. So it's fair to say many of us are somewhat distanced from food production and land fertility issues. But we do know about supply lines. And it is possible these days to assume that most of us have an awareness of how climate is impacting our economy and food security, and how decisions about opening up more and more green fields for housing development will impact the future we are bequeathing to future generations. So we must ask ourselves, what is the difference we want to make? What is the difference I want to make? This is the Matariki holiday weekend, the time when the Matariki constellation of stars rise in the night sky. In times past, it was a seasonal marker in the annual cycle of planting and harvesting of food crops, and a time of recalling and retelling the stories of ancestors who watched over the whānau. It's a good time to ask ourselves what sort of ancestors we will become for generations in the future who look back. Those who look back at this time and remember and recall our lives and actions from their place in history. In the face of the fear and dissatisfaction that seems to be infecting our communities currently and contributing to the increased vitriol against Maori and people we identify as others, we need to ask, are we feeding the fear or feeding a hopeful confidence that together we can choose a different future? Are we passively circling the ground in which an uprising of self-centered protectionism is growing, where the seeds of intolerance towards those for whom society has become confusing and hostile are growing? Or are we offering a vision of a different way? Are we poking at the soil in which antisocial behaviours that we all find upsetting are acted out? Or are we making radical choices to support change? Are we spreading indiscriminate blame? Or are we analysing the facts and looking for possible ways to change? It's imperative we ask ourselves what difference we want to make. What difference will our stories of faith make is a critical question as we select a new vicar. What difference do we want St Matthew in the city to make? What do we want to stand for? How we answer these questions will help us, along with our vicar and our leadership team as they emerge, will help us to shape a strategic plan for the next period of time, perhaps 5 to 10 years. What difference do we want St Matthew in the city to make? Are we able to provide the quality soil in which the seeds of faith and hope can grow and be sustained? Will we honour the covenant between God and humanity that we tell of, and do our bit to disperse seeds of hope and courage and abundant, wasteful love, as our God does? We each have a part to play in the salvation story that we tell. We are the agents of that salvation story. I have a part to play. You have a part to play. As Matthew says, let anyone with ears listen. And I say, take it to heart and act accordingly.